So getting an energy ceasefire buys you a bit of time, right, to think about where the next steps are. It gets a bit of time for the Kremlin because it takes pressure off of them from the Americans. It gets a bit of time for Ukraine, to be honest with you, because you can finally get a bit of sleep at night and possibly come out of this energy crisis. And it gets a bit of time for the Americans to figure out what the hell is going on. Because I'm sorry, I'm a little bit passionate about this. I'm going to come back to a fundamental. You're talking about the most serious invasion in Europe possibly since 1945. We had a report this week, and I think it's a pretty good report, that in terms of military casualties, and that is killed, wounded, captured, on both sides, we're talking at about 1.8 million, more than 2/3 of which is on the Russian side. We're talking about tens of thousands of civilian casualties, and the U.S. it does not have diplomats that are trying to get a settlement here. It does not have people who are trained in mediation and negotiation who are involved here. It has a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law. And that is not a recipe for how you try to end this invasion. It is absolutely not, especially when the Kremlin knows how they can manipulate a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law.
Joining us today, Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, Sofia.
We are following unconfirmed reports that an energy ceasefire may have begun on Thursday, January 29th. Russian military bloggers say Russian forces were ordered to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure across whole Ukraine. The report follows a Financial Times story published on January 22nd, saying the US and Ukraine discussed proposing a limited ceasefire in which Russia would stop attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine halting strikes on Russian refineries and shadow fleet tankers. If Russian dictator Vladimir Putin agreed to this, why would he do so?
Well, I think I have to admit to you, Daniel and Sofia, what I said on Monday. And I said that coming out of last weekend's talks in Abu Dhabi, I didn't have enough information to know exactly where we were, both with the talks and also with the possibility of a ceasefire. And I have to say that since Monday, what we've gotten is a confusion of different claims and reports. So I'll answer your question, Daniel, if I could, and put it in a wider context. On the immediate issue of whether we have an energy ceasefire, at least one that lasts through this weekend, while you have the second set of talks in Abu Dhabi, we'll find out tonight, to be honest with you. You know, if the Russians do not attack tonight, try to hit energy infrastructure, other civilian sites, then maybe they have agreed, because, you know, on a day, night by night basis, they've been firing the missiles, firing the drones, quite often hundreds of munitions, trying to freeze you out, trying to deny you electricity as well as heating. But at this point, what we have are claims from some Ukrainian military personnel and Russian military bloggers, effectively military observers, that say, yes, the ceasefire has been agreed from 7 a.m. Kyiv time, but the Kremlin has refused to confirm this, effectively declined to comment. We don't have any official statement yet from the Zelensky government, nor do we have anything from the Americans as the would-be brokers of this. So I honestly don't know about that ceasefire. But let me put this in the wider context. What has happened in the past 48 hours is a series of very concerning statements that the talks themselves are chaotic, that they are not being handled in a professional manner, especially by the U.S. envoys. Now, on the surface, out of last weekend, the Zelensky government said positive, constructive talks. The Kremlin, of course, said, these talks went well, even though they maintained their maximum demands. They kept on demanding the surrender of Ukrainian territory. And I kept wondering how could that be the case, that everybody's saying the talks are positive when we don't have a resolution in terms of what is happening with the territory. Well, I think we got a clue from the Financial Times. Now, they're citing 8 people close to the discussions. They do not say whether they're Ukrainian, Russian, or U.S. But I know that a couple of them are Americans. Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, and Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, are returning to the ultimatum that they gave Ukraine at the end of October. Now, remember, that ultimatum was worked out with the Kremlin. It was worked out with Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top financial advisor. And that ultimatum was pushed back. In other words, Ukraine said, no, we're not going to surrender all of the Donetsk region in the east of the country. We're not going to go without security guarantees. And Ukraine and Europe were able to push back that demand until we got to these talks last weekend. What Witkoff and Kushner are saying, according to these 8 sources, is Ukraine, you give up all of Donetsk. That demand they made in late October, that demand that Steve Witkoff made in front of Vladimir Zelensky when he last saw Donald Trump. You give up all of the Donetsk region, and then we'll give you security guarantees. So you have this sweetener. Oh, it's not Ukraine surrendering territory. They supposedly get these security guarantees. But these security guarantees are quite vague that are being put out by the Americans. They're not as detailed as even what we've heard in the Ukraine-Europe proposals, that the U.S. will lead the aerial dimension of the security guarantees. And Ukraine, my friends in Ukraine, and you'll know some of these people are coming back and saying, look, in the 1990s, we were given the Budapest Memorandum that was supposedly for our security. What good has that been? We want specifics. Out of the Minsk agreements after Russia seized territory in Crimea in 2014 and was trying to split off eastern Ukraine, where were the specifics in what Ukraine would get in terms of security if it made concessions? That's point 1. If you don't mind me continuing. Point 2. It is now being reported this morning in the Kyiv Independent that Steve Witkoff briefed journalists about how the talks were going and that he showed a disturbing, some of their sources said shocking, lack of knowledge of what is happening. According to the journalists who were on the call, Witkoff did not even know the position of Kirill Budanov, who is now Vladimir Zelensky's chief of staff and very important figure in the Ukraine discussion of where it is in the negotiations. Kirill Budanov also was former head of military intelligence. Steve Witkoff said, oh, he's the vice president. Ukraine doesn't have a vice president. Witkoff also, when he was asked about did Donald Trump want to get an end to the Russian invasion before the 4th anniversary of the full-scale attack, which is on February 24th, said, oh, I don't know the date. I don't know that date. What, you don't know the date? You are mediating the talks and you don't know when the invasion started? Third, and then I'll pause for breath. The Wall Street Journal has a lengthy article today which talks about 3 ways that this might end. That this might end because we get a resolution that stops the Russian invasion. We get an agreement, or Ukraine has to surrender, or Russia has to give up on its invasion. That's not the important part of the article. The important part's in the first few paragraphs, where it puts out a scenario which says Ukraine gives up the Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Then Ukraine will get security guarantees, and then everyone will make money. That is probably a briefing to the Wall Street Journal, if not from Witkoff and Kushner, from those people in the delegation. That puts it right on the table. Ukraine gives up Donetsk. Oh, good. You've given it up. You've given up. Look, Ukraine, you can have these security guarantees. And look, everybody's going to get rich off of this. Rare earth minerals, other investment deals, etc. And I just want to remind folks, I want to take you all the way back to last April, when the Kremlin was on a bit of the back foot because Ukraine and Europe had pushed back against the threat that America would cut off all assistance. They had a psychological study of Steve Witkoff. They wanted Witkoff as the U.S. envoy. They did not want Keith Kellogg, who was supposed to be the envoy to Ukraine and Russia. They got Witkoff. When they got Witkoff as the envoy, the first thing they did is that Kirill Dmitriev, a finance guy, an investment guy, he got a hold of Witkoff. He gave him great tours of St. Petersburg and Moscow, and he said, we can have great economic projects together. Jared Kushner is all about economic projects. If you've seen what happened in Gaza, if you've seen what happens in the Gulf, and if you see what happens here. So I'm going to put all of this together. I don't know about an energy ceasefire. I don't know if that will happen because I don't know who's putting that information out. But what I do know from putting everything else together is that you have unqualified U.S. envoys who are trying to force Ukraine to give up territory under the guise that this will provide a stable settlement because everybody can get rich. And that is very, very dangerous, first and foremost, for people in Ukraine.
Let's also get back to this interesting topic of possible energy ceasefire. Does the Kremlin test a compromise by agreeing to ceasefire or by spreading such information among Russian pro-war, pro-Kremlin military bloggers because they're close to the Kremlin?
I'm going to be honest with you. I think the idea of the energy ceasefire, because you mentioned quite rightly that it came out last Thursday before the first round of the talks, and it was in the Financial Times, that Ukraine and the U.S. had put this to the Russians. I think this is coming from the Americans. I think the Americans are coming out and saying, look, we might get an energy ceasefire, and are hoping the Kremlin will agree to it. Now, the Kremlin might agree to it, but I think the Kremlin is agreeing to it as a way to keep the Americans sweet, right? Everything that Russia is focused on right now, not everything. One of the things that Russians are focused on right now is they want Donetsk. That for them is a minimum. And that's why these talks will not work. I can tell you this right now. If they think they can get Donetsk by pausing attacks for a few days, I think they'll do it, right? But this is why I'm emphasizing to you that this story of the energy ceasefire is part of a much wider story here at a very, very sensitive point in the negotiations. Let me add one other complication, which is confusing. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, was in a congressional hearing on Wednesday. And he talked about a lot of topics. He talked about Venezuela, he talked about Greenland, but when it got to Ukraine and Russia, he said, well, Witkoff and Kushner will not be in Abu Dhabi on Sunday. They won't be there at the second round of talks. He then later said, oh, there will be some U.S. officials there, but he didn't explain who would be there, right? So what exactly are these talks that are going to be in the second round? Are the Americans attempting to get direct Ukraine-Russia talks? Are they providing lower-level mediators? What exactly is going on here? The way I read that Rubio statement here is, and the way that I read the Kremlin statement this morning, that the format of the talks on Sunday has not yet been determined, is that it is uncertain if these talks are going ahead on Sunday. Certainly it's not clear in what format they're proceeding. So getting an energy ceasefire buys you a bit of time right, to think about where the next steps are. It gets a bit of time for the Kremlin because it takes pressure off of them from the Americans. It gets a bit of time for Ukraine, to be honest with you, because you can finally get a bit of sleep at night and possibly come out of this energy crisis. Um, and it gets a bit of time for the Americans to figure out what the hell is going on. Because I'm sorry, I'm a little bit passionate about this. I'm going to come back to a fundamental. You're talking about the most serious invasion in Europe possibly since 1945. We had a report this week, and I think it's a pretty good report, that in terms of military casualties, and that is killed, wounded, captured, on both sides, we're talking at about 1.8 million, more than 2/3 of which is on the Russian side. We're talking about tens of thousands of civilian casualties, and the U.S. it does not have diplomats that are trying to get a settlement here. It does not have people who are trained in mediation and negotiation who are involved here. It has a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law. And that is not a recipe for how you try to end this invasion. It is absolutely not, especially when the Kremlin knows how they can manipulate a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law.
I just want to follow up on this topic on Sunday's negotiations. Indeed, according to Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are not planning to attend this set of peace talks. And for me, I'm curious actually how effective can this meeting be without Witkoff and Kushner, also taking into account, as you said, that Witkoff is not very well prepared for resolving Russian war against Ukraine. And why did Americans and particularly these two persons decide to step back?
I don't know, Sofia, right? I don't know what the heck is going on in Washington because, look, I don't think Witkoff and Kushner are good at trying to supposedly mediate this. But what does that mean if they say, oh, they're not going to be there? I mean, you know this, you can answer this for me. Do you expect Ukrainian officials to sit down at a table with the Russians with no one else there, right? No, I don't think that's going to happen. Okay, so Witkoff and Kushner are not there. Marco Rubio did not indicate he would be there. So who are the Americans who are there, right? And again, I just want to remind you why this is so worrying. Because remember that in the past, the Americans have not prepared very well for these kinds of things. So for example, when Steve Witkoff went to the Kremlin to see Vladimir Putin, you know the infamous occasion when not only had he not prepared for what happened, he didn't have another American official with him, not even an interpreter. The Kremlin provided the interpreter. So I get the impression from what Rubio said that what Witkoff did immediately after round one of the talks, and you know this, is everything's going great. They had a wonderful lunch together and they had such a wonderful time. And we think that President Putin and President Zelensky are going to meet very, very soon. We think this is all coming about. And the Russians came back and said, well, no, I mean, we will meet President Zelensky, but it has to be in Moscow. And then a Ukrainian official said, oh, well, Steve Witkoff, he likes even a basic show of civility, people being nice to each other, and he thinks this is substantial progress in the talks. I don't think they proceeded very far last weekend. And because I don't think they proceeded very far last weekend, I think people in the Trump administration thought, oops, we might embarrass ourselves if we go back this weekend and it doesn't work. And so that's why the confusion here is who would be the Americans who were there, et cetera. And that's why I said, I don't like to make predictions, but it would not surprise me if these talks did not come off on Sunday, that they don't show up in Abu Dhabi.
I think we can move to another topic and discuss Russian losses, because since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, more actually than any major power since World War too, and the number of Russians and Ukrainian troops killed, wounded, or missing during nearly 4 years of war is on track to reach 2 million by this spring, according to a new study reported by the New York Times. Could actually this number become a psychological issue for Russians? And does Russian dictator Vladimir Putin still have enough reasons to justify this bloody invasion to his people?
Well, I mean, Sofia, you saw the Kremlin's reaction to this, which is this is made up. This is fake news. No, our figures, which they have not released since the autumn of 2022, when they acknowledged a few hundred casualties, our figures are the correct ones. Let's get to the factual basis of this and then work out from it. I think, first of all, for full clarity, we need to disclose that also this study, which is from a US-based think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said between 500 and 600,000 Ukrainian casualties. So we need to acknowledge that Ukraine's taken heavy losses as well. It said, however, as you mentioned on the Russian side, more than 1.2 million casualties, and around, if I remember correctly, more than 300,000, may have even been 350,000 of those have been killed. What the study also said, that I think was equally important, is that the rate of territory taken in this invasion is one of the slowest in history. For all this talk that Russia's winning, that this has been a very, very gradual advance in terms of, and you and I know that. We know that, if you take the sum total of what Russia had seized as of 2022 and where we were at the end of 2025, they had gained maybe about 1.5% of Ukraine, and that was it. So it reinforces what we have heard. And what's interesting, I think the general staff of Ukraine had said is around about 1.3 million Russian casualties. That's where Western intelligence agencies are. So I think we can say now these are the Russian figures. But Russians themselves may not know that. I think Russians will know. They have had friends who have been killed. They have had maybe sons or husbands who have been killed. They will know of losses. But remember that this has all been dressed up by the Kremlin on an individual basis of, oh, we value the service that your son, that your husband gave to us. Here's a bit of money, maybe a car sometimes in certain cases. Here's a bonus. And it's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for Greater Russia. And the open question is, how long can they get away with that idea that you sacrifice for what is happening? That's why I think if we tie this issue of the casualties together back with what I'm talking about Donetsk, I think you can bring this together. I think if Vladimir Putin gets the Donetsk region, then he does ceasefire. I think that may be enough for him to go to the Russian people and say, we have fought this valiant war. We are going to rebuild this part of eastern and southern Ukraine as part of Greater Russia. And by the way, the Americans have effectively guaranteed that. That's why it's important that Witkoff and Kushner are there. He can also say to the Russians, these great economic projects, et cetera, et cetera. If Putin does not get to Donetsk, if he does not get to Donetsk, where does he go next, right? Because he cannot go back to the Russian people. He can say, all right, you've got Luhansk. Oh, look, there's a theater in Mariupol. Oh, look, there's Crimea. But that's not what he went into this for. He actually went into it to take all of Ukraine, but he at least wanted to get all of Donetsk. So he's got to give a line to the Russian people. And what you're really asking me, is the line that he gives the Russian people, that's it, we stop. We stop with what we've got. We cease fire. Or is the line is we keep on pressing on? I think it's the latter. I think Vladimir Putin, quite similar to Donald Trump in this way, although he's a lot smarter than Trump, they never want to take a step back. They never want to take a step back and look weak. And that leaves the big open question, will the Russian people support that? And that will take us all the way back around on how much damage does Russia take? This is why President Zelensky says you have to tighten the sanctions. You have to support Ukraine's attacks and expand Ukraine's attacks inside Russia. You have to cause pain inside Russia before the prospect is that Russia will give up this invasion. So it's an open question. Again, however, I will say with that open question, I think I have said this for quite some time. I think the next 6 to 12 months are the important period. I think 2026 is the key year. I think if Putin does not take all of Donetsk this year, they have to have a serious rethink if they keep pressing on.
At the beginning of our discussions, we covered and you mentioned about this Wall Street Journal article with several scenarios. From your perspective, which scenario is more likely to happen?
None of them. I mean, none of them. And now I got to be honest with your viewers, because your viewers are sacrificing each and every day. You all are sacrificing each and every day. But let's just walk through those scenarios. I've just explained to you why I don't think in the short term Russia's going to admit is going to stop. I think as long as they've got missiles or drones to fire across, they'll keep firing them. As long as they can throw men onto the front line and Russians will support those men getting killed, they'll do so. They will lie about the amount of territory they've taken to justify it. And we saw some of those lies this past week. They will not reveal to the extent of their people how much Russia is suffering. So they'll keep pressing on. One of the other scenarios is that Ukraine surrenders. And you all are enduring the worst winter that you've had since 2022. And endure it, people, murders on every night of civilians by these attacks, trying to knock out the heating, knock out electricity, trying to break the will of Ukrainian people. Ukraine has suffered these 500, 600,000 casualties. Can they keep the manpower going to the front line? And we know that, and we have to be honest with you, we know that some Ukrainian men have just left. They've defied the, regulations, and they've just left the country. But do I think that Ukraine will give up, will surrender in all this? No, absolutely not. I don't. This is an existential war for you folks. It's not existential for Russia. If Russia loses, Russia still exists. If you surrender, Ukraine does not exist the way you know Ukraine. Now, you may still have part of the country, but you will have lost part of your nation. You will have lost part of what it means to have regained that independence post-1991. And I don't think you'll give up because, and I will say this, for all the issues around corruption, for all the issues we could talk about the government in this case, I think Ukraine has been blessed to have the president that it has. And I'm not saying this as a fanboy. I'm saying this as an analyst. Had it been a different government, this might have turned out differently. But this government has persisted. And I think Europe will continue to support Ukraine. That's the other factor. Third scenario, there will be a settlement. I can tell you exactly who told the Wall Street Journal that scenario. And that was the Witkoff and Kushner camp. Because remember what they said. We're going to get peace. Everybody's going to get rich. Well, tell me the settlement that you're going to get, because I want to return to three issues. One is recovery. Ukraine must have recovery. Now, the Russians will not want to pay for that recovery. The Americans want to make a profit. So their interest is not Ukrainian recovery. They want to make a profit out of this. So you tell me what that recovery looks like. Two, what happens with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? An issue that people don't quite often talk about, right? Three, what happens with Donetsk? Now, if Russia's not going to accept the fact that it will not get all of Donetsk, and if Ukraine is not going to give up all of Donetsk, how are you going to solve that? And you're not going to solve that with some vague security guarantees. I will give you the wild card scenario that I think might be acceptable, but only this would be acceptable. Only this. And I want your viewers to come back on this. As painful as it would be to give up Donetsk, and as strategically risky as it is to give up Donetsk, would it be acceptable for Ukraine to give up Donetsk if it was effectively treated as a member of NATO? And by that, I mean not vague security guarantees. I mean clear guarantees that are the equivalent to Article 5, that include NATO personnel inside the country and NATO oversight of aerial operations near Ukraine. That is the only plausible scenario I can see, that Ukraine would be guaranteed effectively, we are part of the West. We will be part of the European Union, albeit it may take some time. We will be part of NATO, even if we're not officially a member. And it will take me back to something when we started our discussions several months ago, I said this, and I know it upsets some viewers. The landing point here is probably a scenario which is similar to West Germany and East Germany during the Cold War. The Soviets had control of East Germany. It was part of their sphere. East Germany, however, did not progress economically as well as West Germany. West Germany progressed. It became one of the leading economic powers in Europe. It became a member of NATO. Would not just the government, would Ukrainians accept the short-term division of their country for that scenario, that at least a large part of the country would finally have political and economic and military security and progress? And it is not for me to answer that question. It's for Ukrainians to answer that question.
If Americans will decide to give up on this peace negotiations idea and etc., and stop sharing intelligence data with Ukraine, do you think that Europeans actually are ready to provide Ukraine with the level of intelligence support it needs? Because many Western media now are discussing this possible scenario, and how critical would the loss of US assistance be for Kyiv?
Europe cannot replace all of the US intelligence that's provided. That's just simply a fact. The US has the largest intelligence services in the world. They have some of the most advanced technology in the world, not only in terms of, on the ground, in the air, but even in space. Europe would do as much as it can. But we know from the cutoff that took place last spring by the Americans, we know that it affected not just Ukrainian operations inside Russia, it affected the battlefield. But would we get back to that point? And that raises an interesting question, which is, if the Trump administration or a certain group within the Trump administration again cut off intelligence sharing, it will cause a crisis within NATO. Remember that US intelligence sharing is, of course, also with European allies through NATO. And it's part of what we call the Five Eyes Agreement, which is with the UK, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Canada. You might remember that in the case of this recent case of Greenland, when the United States threatened to seize Greenland, and they were threatening all kind of punishment of Denmark, what happened is that the Europeans pushed back and said, no, we're not going to accept the fact that you get Greenland, even if you threaten us with a cutoff of intelligence, if you threaten us with other measures. I think the same scenario plays out here, because a lot of American officials, their careers are based on working with Europeans in NATO. So they're based on European security. A lot of people whose careers in the State Department are based on European security. A lot of people in the Treasury, financial services, based on European security. Part of the reason why the Americans restored intelligence last year is that those people, along with a couple of important people within the Trump administration, said, you can't cut off intelligence. You can't do this. You're risking not only Ukraine, you're risking Europe. Those people are still there. So there is a huge fight within the administration. There's a general fight right now, and we could talk a little bit later politically where it plays out. But if they cut off intelligence, that fight will get greater within the administration. And if so, it will be a very risky moment for Ukraine, but it will also be a very risky moment for Europe. I'll also tell you this, and it'd be interesting if you talk to all your good friends in Ukraine about this. I think Europe is now making preparations for the day when the United States might not be reliable, that it might disappear. So They are preparing, and it won't happen in a year, 2 years, 5 years. So it won't help Ukraine in the near future. I think they're preparing for a future where they're not dependent on the U.S. intelligence relationship, because with the people around Donald Trump, you can't trust them. You simply cannot trust them.
Professor Lucas, thank you very much for being with us today, for discussing these all topics, and glory to Ukraine.
Sofia, Daniel, thank you. Glory to the heroes.
Glory to the heroes, and thank you, Professor Lucas, for such in-depth analysis today.